Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians on the eastern section of the front line, all within the Donetsk region. The Russians have managed to advance to the west of Pokrovsk towards the city itself, as well as in the northern flank of the city. The Russians also managed to advance in the vicinity of Toretsk, where the Ukrainians are withdrawing from some forward positions as the Russians are pressuring the flanks. Russians also managed to advance in the Serebryansky Forest area as well as in the direction of Toretsk to the east of the Serebryts River line, and on the western bank of the Serebryts River line the Russians continue their advances in an attempt to cut off the main supply route for the Ukrainian forces within Lyman. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance to the west of Pokrovsk, gaining control over some fortified positions and contesting the remaining parts, as they are looking to gain control over the highway leading into Pokrovsk from the west, as well as the railway just to the north of it. Russians are working on gaining full control over these additional supply routes to strengthen their positions within the city. Speaking of the positions within the city, Deep State Map released a statement talking about how the Russian soldiers managed to infiltrate the city. According to Deep State Map, 3 companies of 50 men each were gathering and preparing in Shevchenko. From Shevchenko, they moved upwards towards Pokrovsk on foot. Every day they moved about 500 meters for them to finally reach the city. This very slow pace took place due to the Russians using a lot of camouflage and resupplying themselves using drones. They're moving very slowly and safely to avoid detection by the Ukrainian forces and drones. According to Deep State Map, and I reiterate the fact that casualty numbers cannot be believed from either side, but according to Deep State Map, the Russians lost 120 of these 150 men before they managed to reach the city, and 30 of them managed to infiltrate the city, from which they spread havoc within the city, both along the railway area and the eastern and western parts of it. Deep State Map then claims that there are no longer any of them remaining. However, keep in mind that the Deep State Map claimed this the very first day the Russians were within Pokrovsk, and it has now been 2 weeks since they first infiltrated the city, yet Deep State Map yet again claims it, while claiming it 2 weeks ago, which wasn't true. So again, we cannot trust when they claim these casualty numbers, especially now that the Russians also have the road into the city open to resupply their forces. It is not very believable that the Russian soldiers who managed to infiltrate the city have been wiped out, based on the developments that have taken place since. Deep State Map then stated that the operation was a failure based on these casualty numbers, which cannot be verified. Instead, what we do see on the front line is that the Russians have managed to secure a significant portion of the southern parts of the city, entering the city itself, and even reaching the railway area and several areas within the central parts of the city. And based on that alone, even if 150 soldiers were lost, the operation was successful based on the territorial gains, which in the long term will probably save many more Russian lives than a stalemate outside the city. In the northern flank of the city, the Russians managed to cut off the road between Novoshakhove and Shakhove, which is connected to Drushkivka along the Slovyansko-Shantinivka line. According to Deep State Map, the Russians actually reached all the way to the outskirts of Solochye. A reliable Russian source also stated that Russian soldiers managed to reach the outskirts of Vilna, Novoshakhove, and fighting takes place within the town. The Russians are also fighting within Duroshne in the southwest. Based on these developments, we see that there is a significant infiltration of Russian forces behind the Ukrainian lines here in the northern flank of Pokrovsk, and the Russians are working on cutting off some of the major supply lines that connects the western parts of the Donetsk region with the Slovyansko-Shantinivka line. Russians are able to gain control over Pokrovsk. The front line will likely move at a quick pace northwards due to these infiltrations, preparing the way for the main force of the Russians with these deep operations. To the east, in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians are fighting over an industrial area. According to a Russian source, the Ukrainians are withdrawing from the industrial area and from the remaining parts of the residential area here along the railway area to the high ground along the fortified positions and Klebenbeek. The Russians have pressured the Ukrainians on both flanks, the northern and southern flank through Katerinivka in the west and the northern flank of the industrial area to the north. Both of these directions have forced the Ukrainians into a pocket where the Russians are heavily bombarding the Ukrainian positions, and this forces a withdrawal of the Ukrainians because they cannot turn the situation around. Instead, their best objective is to hold back the Russian forces as long as possible while withdrawing their forces as many as possible from the encirclement, and the Russians simply to inflict as many casualties as possible during this Ukrainian withdrawal out of the operationally encircled pocket. Gaining control over the area south of the reservoir will allow the Russians to focus their forces in the direction of Kostiantynivka and the western flank of the city, as they'll be able to redirect their forces to other sections of the front line, especially the long-range strikes capabilities that is being centered around the pocket to inflict casualties on the Ukrainians. In the direction of the Serbiansky forest area, fighting continues west of the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. The Russians are storming fortified positions of the Ukrainians southwest of Dibrova, getting control of the border area between the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and securing the southern flank of Toretsk. The Russians are also fighting the Ukrainians directly to the south of Dibrova. The Russians are here working on gaining full control over the Serbiansky forest area. To do this, they need to advance to the south of Dibrova through the forest patches down to the river lines that separates the main parts of the forest area to the marsh area of the forest area, which is more difficult to operate within and move through. The Russians are here inflicting as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainians during this encirclement and during the operations to push down south. The main concentration of Ukrainian forces was within this encircled grouping. This is why the Russians are able to quickly advance through the other forest areas, as there are smaller concentrations of Ukrainian forces and generally a smaller presence of them. To the east of Toretsk, the Russians managed to gain control over the forest lands and patches here to the east of the town, leaving the Ukrainians in just a small pocket within Toretsk. And fighting continues to expand in the direction of Zareshne. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the town and move onwards towards Zareshne from across the river line, and at the same time to push down south along the southern outskirts of Toretsk to gain control over the remaining fortified positions along the Serbis river line down towards the Serbiansky forest area to isolate it and split it into two parts, the eastern and western parts along the river line. To the west of the Serbis river line, the Russians continue to advance in the direction of Zareshne, expanding the zone of control in the northern parts of the town along the Nitruis river. The Russians also managed to gain control of additional forest lines along the northern flank of Shentry-Holove, expanding the zone of control to gain full control over Zareshne and directly expand the fighting into Shentry-Holove from the eastern, northern, and western directions, attacking it from three separate directions and cutting off one of the main roads that supplies to the town of Lyman here in the south. Russians continue offensive operations centered around the Donetsk region, where they are working on the flanks of the region and at the same time pushing through the central parts in the direction of Toretsk towards Kostiantynivka. The Russians are looking to gain full control over the Donetsk region as the negotiations continue. This is a major political goal for the Russians. Gaining control over Donetsk will significantly improve their standings with regards to the negotiations. Ukraine and Europe countered the proposal, which was revealed in the media. It's not clear whether it is true or not, as so far no official confirmation of it has come to light. But according to the media, Putin stated that he would be willing to go for an instantaneous ceasefire if the Ukrainians decided to withdraw from the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. According to the media, Witkoff initially misunderstood Putin, thinking Putin stated just the Donetsk region. However, Putin stated all three regions should be withdrawn from completely in case of a ceasefire. Europe is worried that from this ceasefire, the Russians will just continue the war, but instead of focusing on the four regions, they'll expand it to other regions, such as Kharkiv region, to gain full control of it, now that they'll be able to concentrate more forces in one direction, as other operations have been completed. Instead, Europe and Ukraine countered this media proposal by stating for every region the Russians want the Ukrainians to withdraw from, the Russians should withdraw from one themselves. For an example, the Russians requesting a withdrawal from the Donetsk region, the Ukrainians would then withdraw from it, but in exchange the Russians would need to withdraw from the Zaporizhia region or the Kherson region or the Luhansk region, which is clearly not a fair comparison because the Russians control at the least 75% of each of the regions, which means one singular Russian withdrawal is akin to 3 Ukrainian withdrawals, especially considering the fortifications the Russians have fought through over the years. Therefore, if Europe and Ukraine are actually considering such a proposal where one withdraws and another withdraws, then the Russians could be interested in expanding their offensive operations towards the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv regions to gain control over additional regions in exchange for southern regions. And northern regions are less fortified and it's easier to supply the forces compared to the southern direction, especially the Kherson region, if the Russians are able to capture significant portions of the Kharkiv and Sumy regions and can exchange them for the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, while gaining full control over the Donetsk region. The Russians would be able to negotiate their way to a quicker end to the war, while still gaining full control over the 4 regions in the south that they have annexed. In conclusion, what I'm saying is that I do not believe that Putin, Trump, and Zelensky will reach an agreement even if they meet face to face. Instead, it could lead to operations starting by Russians. They'll be targeting different sections of the front line to achieve their goals one way or another, and then finalize it through a negotiation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day. Therefore, if Europe and Ukraine are actually considering such a proposal where one withdraws and another withdraws, then the Russians could be interested in expanding their offensive operations towards the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv regions to gain control over additional regions in exchange for southern regions. And northern regions are less fortified and it's easier to supply the forces compared to the southern direction, especially the Kherson region, if the Russians are able to capture significant portions of the Kharkiv and Sumy regions and can exchange them for the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, while gaining full control over the Donetsk region. The Russians would be able to negotiate their way to a quicker end to the war, while still gaining full control over the 4 regions in the south that they have annexed. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.